Thank you, Jason, and thank all of you for coming out to listen to some challenging information. It's great that there are people questioning what we're being told in the mainstream media and from our mainstream institutions. And it cheers my heart when I run into great people like you. It's the best part of this job is the people you meet as you travel around in person. It's even more fun than meeting people like you on the internet. And there are people like us all over the place. They may not all be here, but just the other day, my 21-year-old van broke down in 100-degree heat and nearly 100% humidity by Lincoln, Nebraska. And we got crazy tow. They had 4 people and a big dog to cram into the tow truck. They sent us 2 huge guys with the tow truck. So all 4 of us and the huge dog had to cram into the back seat of the tow truck in this weather. Anyway, we got to Lincoln, and the van got looked at and repaired. And as it was being repaired, I was sitting there in the waiting room, and there was a guy there just kind of picked up the local newspaper, and I think I noticed that there was a cartoon about Jade Helm, the latest conspiracy rage. And we struck up a conversation, and this guy, he knows everything. I mean, he could be up here talking to you pretty much. Just some random guy I just happened to run into waiting to get his car repaired in Lincoln, Nebraska. So, this is not just an isolated incident. There are more and more people waking up and looking behind the facade, the stage scenery that they prop up and tell us that this is how the world works. Well, no, sorry, that's not how it works. And more people are noticing. And so at some point, God willing, we will reach the 100th monkey position, and things will change pretty quickly, and that's what I'm working to accomplish. Okay, well, we're here to talk about a particular event, the incident in Paris on January 7th. When I first heard that there had been a shooting at the Charlie Hebdo cartoon offices in Paris, and that radical Muslims were suspected of being the terrorists, believe it or not, my first reaction was that it sounded all too plausible. The Charlie Hebdo magazine had carried on this tradition that's been going on since, 2005, when Danish newspapers connected with such neoconservatives as Daniel Pipes started publishing anti-Islam cartoons and angering Muslims. And so this sort of thing has been going on for a while. So when I heard radical Muslims shoot up some cartoonists, I thought, yeah, sure, it could happen. And then, whoa, how many people were killed? Okay, 11 people killed, another 11 injured in the Charlie Hebdo offices. And then in a related incident, 5 more people were killed, plus a total of 3 terrorists in 2 incidents were supposedly killed. I think this brings us up to 19 people killed, a bunch wounded. It's pretty big. And then it got even bigger, as millions of people poured into the streets of Paris and other big French cities, seemingly spontaneously, and they seemed to be staging what looked like a protest. But wait, this was a kind of a strange protest march. But again, let me stress that my first impression, before I even looked at any information about this event, was to feel bad that this is a terrible act of violence, presumably by angry Muslims, targeting cartoonists who had been satirizing Muslims. I hadn't looked that closely at Charlie Hebdo. I didn't know how bad their stuff had been. So I actually kind of sided with the slain cartoonists and thought, this is an embarrassment. As a Muslim, I am totally embarrassed that these, some crazy violent hotheads would kill satirists, because that's what I thought probably happened. And this was another Muslim, actually, who reacted in the same way. This is a Berkeley Muslim cartoonist, Khalil Bendib, who contributed to our book anonymously because he already had his career practically destroyed by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, for publishing pro-Palestine cartoons. He doesn't want to be named in this book, so he's not, but his cartoons are in it. And this was his cartoon, a tribute to the slain Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, who he considered as his brothers and sisters, I guess, or brothers. I think they were all guys. And then, after that first impression, suddenly all sorts of strange things started making me question this event. And of course, I should be the first one to question it, right? I've been working for the truth about 9/11 and JFK and things like that for years. But they got even me with the emotional punch of the first reports. Well, here's the march in Paris.
more than 1 million people in Paris. A total, actually 2 million, I think. I think the total was 4 million plus all over France, possibly 5 million people almost instantly deployed into the streets of France, marching all with identical signs saying, Je suis Charlie. That's a lot of Je suis Charlie signs. Now, does this look like the kind of demonstrations that you've been to? Is there something wrong with this picture? I've been to demonstrations. They mostly have scrawls and, you know, fluorescent day-glow color. Everybody has a different weird-looking sign. Once in a while, there's some sort of anal retentive power freak who prints up a bunch of identical signs. I think that's happened at one demonstration in my lifetime, maybe. But millions of identical signs? That's very strange, isn't it? What's going on here? So this was one of the many pieces of information that came in the aftermath of this shooting that quickly made me start to question what was going on. A lot of people saw some of the same things I saw that I'm going to talk about. So I'm not the only person that came to these kinds of conclusions or asked these kinds of questions. The Ron Paul Institute got pilloried by the neoconservative propagandists for publishing an article by Paul Craig Roberts asking whether the Charlie Hebdo shootings were a false flag. They tried to torpedo Rand Paul's candidacy by associating him with Ron Paul, whose followers are a bunch of truthers. And Roberts, by the way, updated his article, which was published just a few days after the shooting, and it's in the book, We Are Not Charlie Hebdo. Many other high-level people around the world questioned the Charlie Hebdo attacks and suggested they looked like a false flag as well. This was the Turkish President Erdogan, who essentially said that it was an inside job, a false flag. The mayor of Ankara, Turkey, as well, said the same thing. In Russia, top-level Russian media and think tanks were saying the same thing. Even an American politician got some headlines here at the UK Independent by charging that it was a false flag. Interestingly, the Independent published this frame of the alleged terrorists outside the Charlie Hebdo offices with this story, and we'll come to the interesting videotape of these terrorists in a moment. Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is the founder of the National Front, the biggest nationalist party in France, the party that is poised to take power in the next French presidential elections. His daughter, Marine Le Pen, is very likely to be the next president of France. He spoke up immediately after Charlie Hebdo, saying that it was an inside job by the work of Western intelligence agencies. And then, less than a week later, his house was burned, not quite burned down, but damaged badly in a fire, and he was beat up. He showed up with bruises on his face after his house had been burned in a fire, and the official story that went out that he didn't question was that, well, he was injured escaping from the fire. Could be, but I kind of don't think so. So why are all these people saying it looks like a false flag, there's something wrong with this event? Okay, we had millions of people with identical signs. Who printed those millions of signs up? Somebody with millions of dollars? What's that about? So people were asking all these questions, and another reason that they were asking these questions, one of them was that we had a really strange set of mixed messages coming out of the French government. First, we heard the French government was 100% behind these marches through the streets with identical signs of millions of people. For what? For free speech. The French Republic prides itself on its liberté, right? Their slogan is liberté, égalité, fraternité. The first one is liberté, freedom. So they said, we're out there demonstrating for freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the freedom that these cartoonists were trying to exercise when they were brutally shot down by the evil Muslim terrorists. That was the official message from the French government and the demonstrations that it helped sponsor. But in the immediate aftermath of this Charlie Hebdo shooting, or series of shootings if we count the supposedly related ones, the French government enacted the biggest crackdown on political free speech in the history of modern France. They arrested very quickly more than 50 people, and within a month or two over 100 people were arrested for anti-government or anti-establishment political speech. In several cases, jokes, cartoons, and satires. The most popular, best-known cartoonist, or rather comedian in France, Dieudonné, was arrested for tweeting a joke about the Charlie Hebdo attack, a joke that did not sit well with the authorities. And he wasn't the only one. There were others, including there was a teenager who was arrested for doing a Charlie Hebdo parody. So suddenly the French were rounding up people who were not towing the line and not holding the Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie sign. Why was that? you have to ask the question, who gains from this? One of the reasons that all of those people, those famous people, as well as ordinary people and internet sleuths like us, were questioning this, was if you simply ask who's going to gain from this event, the answer was obviously not radical Muslims. Quite on the contrary. What this event did was it united huge numbers of people in the West and around the world behind the slogan, I am Charlie, Je suis Charlie. We are Charlie. We are this Charlie Hebdo magazine that was supposedly shot up. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're identifying with this magazine that during the past several years had been going way over the top, printing obscene, not just blasphemous, but blatantly obscene attacks on Islam, basically doing pornographic attacks on Islamic sacred symbols. They threw in a little bit of anti-Christian pornography as well, a tiny little bit just to spice it up. But it was mostly over-the-top, obscene, ultra-offensive attacks on Islam. So no Muslim in the world could possibly really, who really knew what was going on, hold a sign that says, I am Charlie. That wouldn't make any sense. So what they did was they split the Muslims of the world off from the non-Muslims, especially from the West, and made the West hate the Muslims with the impression that the Muslims are crazed radical fanatics who will run around killing you for making fun of their religion. So who gains from that? Asking who gains from terrorism, when you start looking at history, leads you to some fairly interesting places. Europe has had a fair bit of terrorism over the past half century. And the biggest and most spectacular wave of terrorism that hit Europe since World War II was attributed to left-wing fanatics, people like the Baader-Meinhof gang of Germany or the Red Brigades of Italy. But in fact, we now know, and this is widely acknowledged even by mainstream historians, that the biggest and most spectacular parts of that wave of terror, essentially the whole thing, was stage-managed and perpetrated by NATO. What is NATO? It's, of course, the US military occupying Europe. That's what it really is. So the US military high command actually ordered the bombing of the Bologna train station in, was it 1982, I think it was, as well as similar attacks that killed very large numbers of innocent European civilians. In Brabant, Belgium, shooters shot up shopping malls and killed people on the streets. These were all people that were basically mercenaries that were taking their orders from kind of a parallel command wing of NATO and the US military. Ultimately, they were operating under the authority of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, our highest military command. Why were they doing this? Well, the American authorities were worried that Europeans were going to vote into power socialists and other left-wingers who would accommodate communists, and they would lead Europe out from under American occupation. Maybe, yeah, we're still occupying Europe. Germany is totally occupied. NATO is everywhere in Europe, and it's used to keep Europe under control and keep it following the imperial policy. It's not really American policy. Our masters of empire are not exactly flag-waving Americans, but in any case, so the purpose of this false flag terror implicating leftists was to keep Europe enslaved to hardline authoritarian right-wing leaders who would toe the line of the empire. And this has been proven 7 ways from Sunday. The European Union, the European Parliament has actually investigated this and stamped it. Yes, it happened. So it's widely admitted to be true, even among the mainstream institutions, but people are not supposed to know about it. Here was a quote from Vincenzo Vinciguerra talking about Operation Gladio, how it worked. You had to attack the civilians, people, women, children, far removed from any political game. This would allow authorities to bring in a state of emergency. The state of emergency, which gives the government special powers so it can keep people in line, take their money, and protect them against enemies, foreign and domestic. This is beloved of many political operators, especially today's neoconservatives. They love the state of emergency. They want political life to be nothing but one nonstop state of emergency, uniting us against an evil external enemy. Okay, back to Paris. So people are questioning this. People who know some history are questioning this, like Paul Craig Roberts, the president of Turkey and so on. They're all questioning this. Again, another reason is that we're getting just blatant deception in the aftermath of this Charlie Hebdo operation. We have millions of identical signs that somebody has printed up. That cost a lot of money. They're all carrying it. An orchestrated social media tweeting Je suis Charlie campaign that cost huge amounts of money to push out to the world. And then we have this photo op where world leaders gathered in Paris to lead the millions of people marching to support free speech, to support the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. The only problem was these reports, which you may have seen in the media, showing the world leaders leading the march, were Photoshopped. These pictures, the above picture, which appears to show the world leaders leading a march of millions of ordinary people, was produced by taking the world leaders with their small entourage off onto a very carefully cordoned off side area with lots of security around it to make sure they didn't get anywhere near any ordinary people. Film the leaders marching, here they are being filmed in the lower part, and then Photoshop it to give us the upper image of the leaders leading millions of people. I mean, a more dramatic example of the Orwellian propaganda that dominates our mainstream media could hardly be imagined. Interestingly enough, not everybody went to Paris. John Kerry and President Obama were apparently invited, but they said no. That's interesting. Maybe there was some kind of split in the ruling circles for whatever reason. And Kerry and Obama, as you all know, have had some, say, bad blood with Netanyahu over in Israel. The neocons who are close friends with, they work with the Netanyahu network, that whole network, hardline Zionist network, who are widely suspected of being behind some of these outrages, have had problems with Obama to the point that Andrew Adler, the editor of the Atlanta Jewish Times newspaper, leading newspaper, one of America's biggest Jewish newspapers, editorialized that the Israeli government should kill President Obama because they're in that much danger from Obama signing this, or negotiating and now signing this treaty with Iran. So there's been a split in the ruling circles to some extent. And Kerry and Obama apparently were not that happy about the Charlie Hebdo thing. They didn't fly over, they stayed away from the march. So who showed up? Well, we saw Netanyahu in the front ranks of the world leaders. And boy, he looked like, some people said, a mafia don showing up at the funeral of his victims, kind of to really, pound his chest. So he shouldered his way to the front line of this march, which he was not invited. He, unlike Obama and Kerry, he was specifically disinvited by French President François Hollande. He said, "Stay away, Bibi, we don't want you. You just slaughtered thousands of people in Gaza this summer. We don't want you here." But Bibi was not one to be turned away. So he came to France with waving his Israeli passport. "You can't keep me out, or you're an anti-Semite, I guess." I don't know. And shouldered his way to the front of the march. And then from the march, where Hollande hadn't wanted him to be, he went straight to the Grand Synagogue of Paris and announced that all 1/2 million French Jews were in grave danger if they remained in France, and they should immediately flee to Israel. That would solve Israel's demographic problem, or at least go a long way towards solving it. The question of who gained then would point in part to those Israeli leaders who were very concerned about their demographic crisis, in which Jews have already become a minority of the people living in historic Palestine. And interestingly enough, if we go back before this Charlie Hebdo operation and look at Netanyahu's history, he had just threatened France in August of 2014 in an interview with French television. Netanyahu said, quote, "If France criticizes Israel," this is in relation to the Gaza massacres, "if France criticizes Israel instead of the terrorists, this plague of terrorism will come to your country." So he threatened France that if France continued to side with the Palestinians in Gaza, this wave of terrorism will come to France. That was less than half a year before the Charlie Hebdo wave of terrorism came to France. And he warned that Palestinian statehood recognition by France would be, quote unquote, a grave mistake. Well, then what happened? The French, in December, 1 month before the Charlie Hebdo event, voted to recognize a Palestinian state. Exactly what Netanyahu had threatened them not to do. 1 month later, boom, Charlie Hebdo happens. People are being killed in Paris, and Bibi Netanyahu is stomping to the front of the line and then telling all the 500,000 French Jews to flee France. This looks pretty bad. Not just to people like me who side with the Palestinians in this particular dispute, but to a lot of people who don't, including Barry Chamish, who contributed to this book, We Are Not Charlie Hebdo. Barry is a right-wing, strongly pro-Zionist, Israeli, Jewish Israeli investigative reporter. But he's not an idiot, and he's not a conscious liar. And so he's in this book saying it looks like Bibi Netanyahu was behind the Charlie Hebdo terrorist event. That's a heck of a thing for one of Israel's leading investigative journalists who's a strong right-wing pro-Zionist to say. And it's one of the most amazing pieces of, of writing in this book. But it probably wasn't just the Israelis. Some in the book actually point away from that and say, no, the Israeli angle here might just be partly a distraction because the real action might be with this NATO empire, the larger empire of which Israel is just a part. And Webster Tarpley is one of these people, as you'll see if you read his essay in the book. Webster Tarpley is one of our greatest alternative historians, and he notes that President Hollande of France had been cozying up to Putin of Russia and trying to negotiate an end of the sanctions that were being slapped on Russia. By who else? The neocons, our favorite warmongers. They want war with Iran, they want to smash up the Middle East for Israel, but they also would love to go to war with Russia and maybe China. They never heard of a war possibility that they didn't like. So Hollande wasn't really getting with that program. Hollande was resisting, and he was about to torpedo this whole sanctions regime on Russia. And so according to Tarpley's reading of the Charlie Hebdo massacre, this was designed to send a message to the French ruling circles and especially to Hollande. He had also not been marching in lockstep with Libya policy. The Libya situation is a tragedy. Let's not get into the details, but basically our empire has trashed, destroyed, and demolished Libya, murdering its president Gaddafi and turning it into a complete failed state run by gangs, militias, organized crime elements, and so on. And so Hollande had been fighting other elements of the empire on Libya too, as well as on Russia. And he had also supported the anti-bankster Syriza party in Greece, which was really getting out of line with NATO. So he was bucking NATO on several fronts. And suddenly, boom, this Charlie Hebdo thing happens. France becomes much more disciplined. France is brought back into the war on terror and marching in lockstep with NATO. Tarpley thinks that was actually the #1 reason for Charlie Hebdo, not Netanyahu and the Israeli angle. And then Hollande was rewarded because just like Bush on 9/11, who went from like 15%, 20%, some very ridiculously low popularity rating to 90%. He went from like the lowest to the highest in terms of popularity rating overnight due to 9/11. Likewise, President Hollande benefited politically from the Charlie Hebdo attacks. So as he has to toe the line and stop behaving independently, he also is rewarded by having his popularity shoot back up. Okay, let's look at some of the actual forensic evidence or direct evidence that this was a false flag. The stuff that so many of these people were pointing to, from the Turkish politicians to the Russian intelligentsia to Paul Craig Roberts, the former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, one of the 100 most influential people in the world, according to Who's Who. He's in the book saying it's a false flag. Why? Well, here's a piece of evidence.
I'm going to show you some footage of the Charlie Hebdo shootings, which has been restricted or taken down from a number of websites. As you'll see, it contains no blood, gore, or graphic violence. It does, however, punch a major hole in the official story. You can draw your own conclusions. The following clip was played on France 24. You'll notice in the middle, a section is edited out.
Des coups de feu en plein Paris. Deux hommes viennent d'abattre un policier. Il est 11h30 ce mercredi. Armés et cagoulés, les deux hommes repartent. Ils revendiquent leur acte.
Let's look at the clip that was edited out. Now, if we zoom in and slow it down, you'll see that the officer isn't actually hit by a bullet. There is a blast that hits the sidewalk just in front of him, but he is clearly not hit in the head as the corporate media is claiming. Let's watch it again. Notice that the head isn't rocked by the blast as it would be if he was actually hit. Notice the plume of dust about a foot in front of him as the shot hits the ground. This is an AK-47. A hit to the head would splatter blood and brains all over the sidewalk. Anyone who claims that this footage shows someone being hit in the head by a 7.62 by 39mm round either has no experience with guns or is lying. This is a big bullet that does massive damage and makes a bloody mess. This officer was not killed by a gunshot to the head. My first thought here was, okay, they missed. Just one problem. Every single mainstream media outlet is claiming that he was finished off with a shot to the head, and that's blatantly false. So then you have to ask, what else are they lying about?
So we have a little problem here. This apparent shooting, it looks like what happens here is that the guy dressed up as the terrorist in the black ski mask goes by, kind of aims at the head, and then swivels the barrel a little further, so it's not aiming at the head when he actually fires the shot. And the shot then kicks up a little dust bunny on the sidewalk. An AK-47 bullet, a live round, would splinter and crater the concrete of the sidewalk. It wouldn't kick up a little dust bunny. So what this indicates is that he was shooting blanks. Blank rounds are cotton or paper wads, and the cotton or paper wad exits from the muzzle not at the head of the ostensible victim, but rather maybe a meter or so in front of him, and kicks up a little dust. So they're shooting blanks, and they're kind enough to not shoot the blank actually at the head of the ostensible victim, which would be very painful, though not life-threatening. That's very odd. If there's a fake shooting in front of the Charlie Hebdo offices, it kind of makes you wonder what happened in those offices. Additionally, it's very odd that the media censored this video. The part that you just saw was never shown on the mainstream media. Why not? Well, as you heard, they censored it because, well, what they said was it was too bloody. They said, this is too gory and bloody, and we can't show you this part. Actually, the real problem was the opposite. It wasn't gory and bloody enough. It didn't show an actual shooting. This left a lot of people scratching their heads. And ballistics experts I've talked to all agree with the interpretation expressed in that video you saw. Okay, how about the ostensible perpetrators? Let's go over what supposedly happened. These two guys, according to the most recent official story, the Kouachi brothers, entered the Charlie Hebdo offices, were able to talk their way past what little security there was, because interestingly, the level of security at the Charlie Hebdo office was massively downgraded a week before. So they got through there, went in, killed 11 people, wounded 11, fled, as you saw them supposedly fleeing. So who are these guys who did this? Now, the witnesses who saw this said these guys looked really slick, like special operations people who were just click, click, click going through. You know, they don't look like amateurs. Who are they? Well, the Kouachi brothers were a pair of hapless lowlifes, very, very well known to all the big intelligence agencies, not just French intelligence, but US, probably Israeli, and certainly British intelligence, because the British mainstream media has reported that these guys were totally covered by British intelligence. One of them, actually I think both of them, were busted for child pornography years before, and that was made to go away. Now, if something like that happens, these are Muslims, they're low-life Muslims living in the banlieue ghetto of France, hanging around with all the low-life characters and the hardcore political people and all the that milieu, that's their world. And so if they're busted for child pornography and then that's made to disappear and they go their merry way, that kind of suggests, to me at least, knowing what I know about how Muslim communities have been treated by the establishment, the powers that be, they're agents. They've been made into assets. They're intelligence assets. And their record shows that they were certainly intelligence assets. They did things that normal people couldn't do. They traveled to Israel and went from Israel into Jordan, Syria, and I forget if they went further to Yemen, supposedly. I think they supposedly went to Yemen. This is impossible. You can't get into Jordan and Syria if you've gone to Israel. If it's stamped on your passport, they won't let you in. Like if I went to Israel, I would never get into a Middle Eastern country again. Unless, of course, you're working for the Israelis. If you're working for the Israelis, they will, oh, would you mind being a synonym or an unpaid asset of our intelligence services? Or better yet, would you mind being a paid asset of our intelligence services? Sure, we'll just be kind enough to not stamp your passport, and you'll be getting some help doing what we'd like you to do down the line. So that must have happened with these guys. And another odd thing about these guys, besides the fact that they were just kind of lowlifes, not exactly people you would think would be special ops level killers, to say the least, is that rather than being captured and interrogated, and that's what you'd want. If these were like real serious Islamic State or al-Qaeda terrorists who are working with a very capable foreign, international terror network, perpetrating huge outrages, killing lots of people, who knows what they're going to do next? Well, are you going to just hunt them down and kill them? Or are you going to capture them and interrogate them? Just like with bin Laden, this whole story that they supposedly just hunted down bin Laden just to kill him, if he was a real terrorist mastermind, that would make no sense at all. They would sacrifice anything to get him alive and interrogate him if that were the case. Likewise with these guys, but no, they were clearly just hunted down and killed like dogs. No effort whatsoever to get them alive. It was just like a hunt, like a fox hunt of the British, whatever. They were hunted down and silenced. And that makes you wonder, why were they silenced? Well, maybe because if they were intelligence assets, that's not something that we would really like to come out. And if they were told to do this and that set them up as patsies, that's not something that should come out either. And this was the anchor moment. I was discussing this with Fran Schur that when we interpret what's going on in a complex, ambiguous situation, sometimes there's like an anchor that, oh yeah, okay, this is what frames it for me. Now I know what's going on. Okay, like the controlled demolition on 9/11, once you get that, I get it. This is an inside job, right? So you see something and then you're able to frame the whole picture. Well, for me, I think one of my major anchor moments here was when Bernard Cazeneuve, the Interior Minister of France, said that the only mistake that these terrorists made was to drop their ID card in their abandoned getaway car. They would never have been captured if they hadn't conveniently dropped their ID card in the abandoned getaway car. I had to read that again and read it again. What is he saying? A highly trained special forces style terrorist is hardly likely to accidentally do something like that. If they're going to conceal their identities in ski masks, I don't see why they would be throwing down their ID card. It's kind of laughable, and it reminds us of so many other similar cases. From the initial report that we were initially told by the Dallas police that the reason that we caught Lee Harvey Oswald, the supposed lone assassin of President Kennedy, was because they found that he had dropped his ID card at the site of the shooting of Officer J.D. Tippit, the crime for which Oswald was initially arrested. And when the reporters rolled their eyes at that, the police withdrew the claim and said, oh no, we didn't really find his ID card there. After 9/11, multiple hijacker passports showed up in very bizarre circumstances. At the World Trade Center, al-Suqami apparently had his passport, if the official story were correct, a 767 plowed into the World Trade Center tower, and the tower then, a little over an hour later, exploded into dust from the fires, and not one, virtually not one identifiable piece of that plane was ever recovered with the parts numbers on it, the replacement dates, which all planes are just full of. All the parts have that stuff. Not one identifiable part from the alleged planes used on 9/11 was found at any of those 4 locations where the plane supposedly crashed. Nothing was found. No DNA from the crash. Not even the black boxes. The government says the indestructible black boxes from these planes that supposedly plowed into the towers were never found. So nothing survived these crashes. Everything just vaporized except one thing, Suqami's passport, which drifted down into the street, was found by a nameless, an anonymous source who delivered it to the authorities and went his merry way. You can't make this stuff up. So when I see these miraculously appearing ID cards, and that's the only way we caught the terrorists, that just makes me, come on guys, you can do better than this. You can come up with a better backstory. And then there was a little contretemps. This guy, Hamid Murad, was originally going to be the third man, the third terrorist. Because right when this happened, I think Cazeneuve, the same guy, the Interior Minister, almost immediately said there were 3 terrorists involved in this. 3 terrorists. Now, the film we have and the witnesses all saw 2 guys in ski masks. 2 guys get in the car and they drive themselves away. But Cazeneuve instantly is saying, there are 3 terrorists, there are 3 terrorists. And then the next day, the 2 brothers dropped their ID cards in the car. We got them now, let's hunt them down and kill them. And they said, this is the 3rd man, Hamid Murad. Problem. Just before the French government had put out this story that Hamid Murad was the 3rd terrorist, which nobody saw, which probably didn't exist, this Murad had turned himself in at a local police station, where presumably those cops were normal cops, rather than agents of whoever did this thing. So Murad had witnesses. He had alibi witnesses too. He'd actually been in school when the Charlie Hebdo shooting happened. So he survived. They didn't hunt him down and silence him. And Cazeneuve, though, turned out to be right. He must have seen some loose version of the script, because it turned out there were actually 3 terrorists. Coulibaly was the 3rd terrorist. But he wasn't part of the shooting at the Charlie Hebdo offices, we're told. No, he did a parallel event 2 days later. Just as the Kouachi brothers were being hunted down like dogs and silenced, Coulibaly, who supposedly knew them, he actually shot a cop, and then he went into a kosher deli in the Jewish part of France, of Paris, and he took hostages. I think he killed 1 policeman and 4 hostages in the deli, and then the police shot him through the window of the deli. And this is an actual video, a news video, supposedly, of the police shooting the terrorist Coulibaly, who's an African Muslim. But what's interesting is that if you watch the video, you'll see that, as this still frame suggests, during the whole video, it's like he's being thrown, and he goes like this with his hands together as he's off balance, being kind of thrown in front of the window, and then they shoot him down. They shot him down in handcuffs.
Il est 17h14. La colonne d'assaut des hommes du raid est lancée. On entend des détonations. Le rideau métallique s'ouvre. À l'intérieur, on aperçoit un homme à terre. L'assaut final est donné, longuement nourri à l'arme automatique. Au fond du magasin, on peut apercevoir un homme surgir. Des grenades sont lancées pour stopper sa route. Le forcené armé est immédiatement stoppé par des dizaines de coups de feu. Les otages peuvent enfin sortir de l'enfer, se mettre à l'abri. Un policier blessé est évacué. Un autre est au sol. L'assaut est terminé. Il a duré moins de 3 minutes.
What's that about? That's not what we're told happened. We're told that, he was keeping hostages, he killed some of them, and the police rescued their other hostages by shooting him. Well, who handcuffed him? I don't know. That's maybe he just went dancing to the front window to be shot with his hands held together like that for some reason. But it kind of looks like his hands are tied or cuffed. Now, this Coulibaly, who you just witnessed being executed by police, apparently in handcuffs, was an old pal of who else? Sarkozy. Now, if you're not up on French politics, Sarkozy took over France as president after the reign of President Jacques Chirac. You may recall that after 9/11, when the US, under George W. Bush, wanted to invade Iraq, the French president, the then president Chirac, resisted. He was not going to join the coalition of the willing. I think there's some indication he catched a jaundiced eye on 9/11 as well. So anyway, Chirac then was essentially overthrown. He and his party they were overthrown in what amounted to a neoconservative coup d'etat. And this man, Sarkozy on the right, was installed as the next French president. Sarkozy, there's no other way to put it, he is a hardline, right-wing, extremist Israeli agent. He is an Israeli agent reporting to the Netanyahu faction of Israeli politics. So he's an agent of Netanyahu or a collaborator, what have you. He's part of that network. So he ran France as a Zionist fiefdom. Under his presidency, France essentially became Israeli-occupied territory. And interestingly enough, Coulibaly, this so-called terrorist who supposedly got shot down after taking those hostages in the deli, had been used in a public relations event for Sarkozy years earlier. This is the news story. This 27-year-old Muslim African kid from the ghetto meets Sarkozy is a big news story. Really? Just some random 27-year-old guy from the ghetto just meets with Sarkozy, and Sarkozy hears the actual thoughts of the disaffected youth of color in France? Maybe that's a coincidence that this is the same guy who turned out to be the supposed Charlie Hebdo terrorist, but a more plausible interpretation is that just like the brothers, the Kouachi brothers, their acquaintance, Coulibaly, was probably an asset, an intelligence asset. Call him an asset of the deep state. And he was presumably manipulated into position to take credit for this terror incident in the deli. How that happened, whether he actually did kill people in the deli, who knows? There are a whole lot of ways to manipulate people into becoming blamed for these kinds of events. Another huge red flag that led all of those people to say this looks like a false flag was the suiciding of French police officer Elric Fridou. Elric Fridou was investigating suspicious links involving the editor of Charlie Hebdo, Charb. On the night of the attacks, he found something amazing, some huge discovery. He called his family, told them he'd found something big. He was going to be working all night in his office. Then late that night or into the wee hours of the following morning, 1, 2 a.m., he was found with a bullet in his brain, in his office, dead. A lot of us saw this. We said, there's something wrong with this picture. And then they wouldn't let his family see the autopsy. That's a direct violation of French law. Under French law, the family of murder victims have a right, or the family of anybody has the right to see the autopsy of their loved one, but the French authorities will not allow his family to see the autopsy. His family all says it was not a suicide. There's absolutely no likelihood, no signs, no reason to think this guy would commit suicide, especially when he's on this big case and he's excited about a breaking lead. So it looks like he was suicided. This is his mother, and she's not at all happy with this situation. She's one of the many survivors of Charlie Hebdo who are not happy. So here's what Officer Elric Fridou was investigating. He was investigating the supposed family links between Charb, the man in this picture, and Jeannette Bougrabe, who's on your right, the right of Charb. And that's Jeannette Bougrabe's daughter as well. So here's a family photo that immediately after the killing of Charb and the other Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, Jeannette Bougrabe here stepped into the media limelight almost as if it was all set up for her to do so, and quite histrionically played the role of the grieving widow of Charb, saying that they had been each other's significant other for a long time, producing this photo, the supposed family photo, and running around the newspapers all over the front pages, all over the TV, grieving the loss of the love of her life. Immediately, Charb's entire family, except his parents, but all the others, and all of his close friends united to say, she's lying. There was no such relationship. We know who Charb's real girlfriend was, and it wasn't her. And we would have known if it was her. She was barred from his funeral. They wouldn't let her. The family kept her out of the funeral. And yet the French media keeps on more or less accepting her claims that she had a relationship with Charb. Well, this was what the suicided officer, Elric Fridou, was investigating. And just recently, there was a piece published in Paris by an investigative reporter named Hicham Hamza. It was called The Key Lie of Jeannette Bougrabe, Mensonge Clé de Jeannette Bougrabe. And he points out that Bougrabe was caught lying when she said that she had never had the key to Charb's apartment. Well, it may be true that while Charb was alive, she didn't have the key to Charb's apartment because she was not his significant other. She's a liar. She acquired that key immediately after the shooting. Charb's shocked parents gave it to her. Shortly thereafter, Charb's apartment was completely cleaned out. A professional intelligence agency type cleaning team went in there and got everything out of there. So it appeared, so you're all wondering, well, what's this about? Fake relationship between Charb, the editor of Charlie Hebdo, and Jeannette Bougrabe. Who is she? She's a professional Islamophobe like Pam Geller, and she's another operative of the Netanyahu-Sarkozy network. She served in a fairly high position in Sarkozy's Zionist-dominated, Zionist occupation government in France. Why is she lying and saying that she was the girlfriend of Charb when she wasn't? The best hypothesis that we can come up with is that this was what in intelligence circles is called a legend. A legend is a false backstory, the fake story that you try to convince everybody is what's going on. And that's used to cover something else. What might this legend of a fake relationship between Jeannette Bougrabe and Charb have been used to cover? Well, most likely covert financial transfers that kept Charlie Hebdo in business, even though it was losing piles and piles of money for years. Nobody could figure out in Paris how Charlie Hebdo kept alive because it wasn't selling well, low ad revenues. Clearly, it's been financially non-viable, or it was, until this public relations event turned them all into zillionaires. But before the shooting, they were going out of business every week by week. Every week they've just gone out of business again. But then they're there again to publish. What's going on here? And the hypothesis would be that somebody wanted Charlie Hebdo to keep putting out these pornographic anti-Islam provocations precisely to set up the situation in which they could stage this public relations event. And now we have even, as with 9/11, where a significant number of 9/11 victims' families are calling it a false flag and wishing that we could get some justice quite publicly. We have the same thing happening now in France. This is Maryse Wolinski. She's the widow of, I think it's Georges Wolinski, who was the best of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, according to those who follow these things. Georges Wolinski actually was a legend in French political cartooning, and many people say he was the only person at Charlie Hebdo who had any talent. And the only reason he was there was they paid him. You know, he was, somebody had the money to pay him to be part of Charlie Hebdo. And then he got shot. His widow, and this leads me to think that there was a real shooting, that, you know, these people really got killed, presumably including George Wolinski. His widow is questioning the official story big time right now. Well, as this Charlie Hebdo truth movement developed in early February and on into, you know, late February, I got this book published by March 1st. So this was a new record in terms of getting a book out in this kind of situation. So as this was developing, we had an amazing fake BBC website appear, and I was in it. It looked like the BBC had reported on the Charlie Hebdo truth movement. And it was a very high quality forgery. Usually internet hoaxes tend to be pretty low quality. You can see through them easily if you know what you're doing. But this, I got fooled. It sure looked like the BBC. If you click the links, you get to actual BBC pages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You play the video, and you hear that BBC voice doing exactly the right BBC narration. But what the voice is saying is quite incredible, which is it's reporting on the doubts that have been raised about what really happened in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo event. So I got taken in. That's, wow, the BBC actually reported something honest about this Charlie Hebdo thing? You know, maybe we're moving into a whole new era of truth in big media. Turned out to be a forgery. And then you have to ask the question, well, who would do that? You know, who put significant resources into producing such a high quality forgery? Some folks would say, well, maybe they were just trying to mess with us. I don't know. Others have suggested, actually I was the first one I think who suggested that maybe there was an experiment to see what would happen if a big media outlet actually reported the truth about a false flag event fairly close to the time it happened. You know, what if somebody at the New York Times, the editor of the New York Times, had decided to run with a Building 7 controlled demolition story the day after 9/11, or 2 days or whatever? What would happen? So, or, you know, maybe something a little less extreme, but clearly, even though there's a lot of control over the media, all kinds of things sneak through. And a few honest people at some media outlet like BBC, who knows what they could do if they wanted to. So maybe what this was an experiment to see how does the truth spread about it? How do these truthers spread their conspiracy theories so we can try to stop it if it actually happens for real? And they might have had internet trolling bots and who knows what kind of technology these people have to watch how the news about this BBC report telling the truth about Charlie Hebdo, or questioning Charlie Hebdo, was being promulgated. Was it being sent by emails? Was it being sent through Facebook? Were people going to websites? And they could do the whole 9 yards, and then they know how to counter-react to stop it if it ever happens in real life. And sure, you say, well, this sounds pretty paranoid, right? Well, we have evidence that things like this have happened. When the Russia Today 9/11 Operation Gladio program was broadcast shortly before September 11th 2 years ago, it went mega viral. It was on the slope to reach hundreds of millions of views before the 9/11 anniversary. And suddenly, it disappeared from every search engine, including the YouTube search engine, and people who tried to email the URL of that video to their friends found that their email did not reach its destination, but instead disappeared into a black hole in cyberspace. And that succeeded in stopping the spread of 9/11 and Operation Gladio, the RT Russia Today special. There's been work done on this by library sciences expert Elizabeth Woodward and others. So there's some, you know, the internet is a battlefield, information battlefield, and they're using all the weapons they have. If you're not already convinced that this was highly suspicious and a probable false flag, how about the location where these terrorists changed getaway cars and dropped their ID card? Where else but right in front of the Israeli Defense Forces headquarters in Paris? Right, I mean, unofficial IDF headquarters. And JDL headquarters. JDL is the Jewish Defense League, which is an extremist. It's listed as a terrorist group by the FBI, but they're legal in France and Canada. They're a terrorist group in the US, but they're legal in France and Canada. Every year, the Jewish Defense League holds a huge party celebrating the successes of the Israeli Defense Forces killing Palestinians. And they do that right here at Pâtisserie. Pâtisserie is kind of a cafe bakery thing. And that's where they have their big party. It's run by hardline extreme Zionist supporters of the terrorist group, the Jewish Defense League. So right in front of this is where the terrorists drop off their getaway car, hijack, supposedly carjack, another getaway car from a nice old Jewish gentleman, and drive away in that, leaving their ID card in the original abandoned getaway car. Right in front of this place. You can't make this stuff up. And the nice Jewish gentleman whose car they supposedly carjacked to second getaway car, he said that the terrorists told him to tell the media that it's al-Qaeda in Yemen. Okay, whatever. I mean, that guy may not have been in on it. There may have been professionals playing the role of the terrorists doing this and actually doing a carjacking. Or it could have been, maybe he was in on it. I don't know. There's been all kinds of video, messing with videos. We already heard about how the video of the police officer being shot on the street was censored. Here we have a Polish worker who was standing up here with a perfect view of the escape and gun battle of the Charlie Hebdo terrorists, was scrubbed out of the video when it was put out in the mainstream media. This Polish worker who was taking that high-quality video from the perfect spot of this whole thing turns out to be connected closely with a certain Laurent Dassault. Laurent Dassault is a French-Israeli billionaire extremist, pro-Netanyahu guy who's one of the biggest armaments business people in Israel and Europe. And it was his building where this supposed Polish worker that nobody can find got perfect film of the event, almost as if he had known that it was going to happen there. The story of Charlie Hebdo being bought by the Rothschilds, mea culpa. This is the one part of this book that got something factually wrong. For a book that came out less than 3 months after the event that it analyzes, I think this book, We Are Not Charlie Hebdo, is incredibly factually accurate. It has held up beautifully so far. But the one thing that I'm going to have to change in subsequent editions is the description of Charlie Hebdo being bought by the Rothschilds. This was the result of a deceptive news story in a Dutch publication, which said that or implied rather strongly that Charlie Hebdo had been bought by the Rothschild family shortly before the shooting. Turns out that that probably wasn't the case. It appears that Charlie Hebdo was in fact bought by the Rothschilds when they bought Libération. See, it's actually unclear where the money was behind Charlie Hebdo. Let's be honest. But we know who printed Charlie Hebdo, millions and millions of copies, as soon as this operation happened, and that was Libération, which is owned by the Rothschilds. So basically, Libération took over logistically the Charlie Hebdo operation immediately after the shooting. But the story that Charlie Hebdo was bought by the Rothschilds right before the event is actually not true. And I regret to say that I went with that false story, which who knows who planted it, in the book, and so did Barbara Honegger, one of the contributors in the book. So if you buy the book and read it, as far as I know, that's the only factual error in the whole book. But good luck finding more. I'm sure when I go over it with a fine-tooth comb, I might find a few more. In any case, it was the Rothschilds who printed the 5 million copies and presumably also printed the millions of identical signs. The Rothschilds, by the way, are the founding family of the State of Israel and the world's biggest international banking family. Those who believe that there is a New World Order bankster conspiracy that's pulling the strings behind current events point at the Rothschilds as being at the absolute center of that spiderweb. So it is kind of interesting that it was their money that printed the 5 million copies, and whoever it was that kept Charlie Hebdo alive while it was losing money made it all back and then some, and then a whole lot more, because this shooting, of course, made Charlie Hebdo a household name all over the world, and they just raked in the money. They'd probably made hundreds of times what they had lost keeping it alive when nobody was reading it. And then we had a follow-up incident. In Copenhagen, Denmark, on Valentine's Day, a little over a month after the Charlie Hebdo shooting, almost exactly the same thing happens. We have an attack on a national symbol, and then an attack on a Jewish target. That was what happened in Paris We had the attack on Charlie Hebdo, which is a symbol of free speech, liberté, a French national symbol. And then we had an attack on the Jewish kosher deli. And the two things were then welded together in the popular mind. In Copenhagen, same thing. We had an attack on the cartoon. There was a blasphemous free speech cartoon meeting where the Danish guy, a couple of Danish guys who've been involved with doing anti-Islam cartoons were meeting to promote free speech in the wake of Charlie Hebdo. So somebody came up and fired a few shots at that, supposedly, and then went to a local synagogue at 1 in the morning and fired a few shots at the local synagogue. And I think there was one injury to an ankle of a security guard, and that was it. Nobody got hurt, except for, of course, the terrorist, who was naturally gunned down like a dog, so he couldn't talk. So once again, same thing. Attack on a national symbol of free speech, attack on a Jewish target. And these two events, Charlie Hebdo and Copenhagen, were not the only ones. Before that, there was a precursor. It was called the Mohammed Merah shooting. Several years before the Charlie Hebdo shooting, we had another case where there was attack on a French national symbol, attack on a Jewish target. The two are welded together in the popular consciousness. This was a shooting of French soldiers. The actual perpetrator was apparently a blue-eyed neo-Nazi with a neo-Nazi tattoo. That's what the witnesses said. But then, next day, there's a shooting in a Jewish school, we're told, and an orchestrated effort blames the same guy, Mohammed Merah, who is then hunted down and shot down like a dog so he can't talk. So that was an attack on the French national symbol, the French soldiers, and then an attack on a Jewish target, a Jewish school. There's an article about this as a prequel to Charlie Hebdo in this book by Dr. Laurent Guyénot, who's a PhD medievalist as well as a PhD engineer, a brilliant man. And he shows how this Merah shooting with attack on the national symbol, attack on the Jewish target, weld the two things together in the popular mind. Then the same thing with Charlie Hebdo, and then the same thing a month later in Copenhagen. So it's really not that complicated what's going on here. The agenda is not really being hidden very well. And then, of course, Charlie Hebdo is the terror gift that keeps on giving. We're going to have this war of Muslims versus free speech cartoonists for who knows, the war that will not end in our lifetimes, or maybe they'll just do the cartoon thing for a few years and milk that dry, and then they'll come up with something else. But that's obviously the new theme. So we had in Garland, Texas, recycling Charlie Hebdo. We have a Mohammed cartoon event, and a couple of Muslims are supposedly going in there to shoot it up, and they step out of their cars and get gunned down like dogs and silenced. And according to their pro-ISIS Facebook tweets or what, Facebook and tweets or whatever, oh, it's the ISIS terror threat. You know, it's radical Muslims versus cartoons, the same meme, the same theme. You're going to hear more and more of this. For the past few months, there have been these Draw Muhammad events, encouraging people to draw insulting cartoons of sacred Islamic symbols and figures. Even on the 4th of July, there were 4th of July picnic and fairground events that were Draw Muhammad events. So this Charlie Hebdo thing has created a whole new kind of focus in the so-called war on terror. It's the Muslims versus cartoons. Muslims versus free speech, Muslims versus our Western values, and Muslims versus Israel, of course, because Israel stands for free speech, Western values, and all of that. That's the theme. That's what they're pounding into our brains over and over and over and over. And to some extent, it's working. I mean, the media, of course, is promulgating it. A lot of ordinary people in the streets are buying it. The half-bright people who watch false news are, they're getting it. They're getting this meaning from it. But it's... And one of the reasons that they've stopped a lot of folks from thinking critically about this, I think, is they've convinced us that 2 + 2 make 5, right? When they convince us that the way to react to an attack on free speech is to have the government shut down free speech, that is senseless. It's completely ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. Like so many of these things I've showed you here, they don't make any sense. But if people accept them, if you accept stuff that you're being told that doesn't make any sense, you lose your ability to resist and your ability to think critically. Orwell said that the only freedom that matters is the freedom to say 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. But we're not allowed to say 2 + 2 make 4. 2 planes completely annihilate 3 buildings. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense mathematically, but it works. People, and once you've accepted that, you'll accept anything. And likewise here, okay, they hate our freedoms, so we have to get rid of our freedoms. That's what they told us after 9/11, isn't it? They just recycled that with Charlie Hebdo. My response to all of this was to organize the first book that dissected a likely false flag very quickly after the actual false flag happened. With 9/11, it took what, a year? Well, it took half a year for Terry Mason's work to come out. It took a year, over a year for some of the work on the demolitions. And David Ray Griffin didn't really get this stuff out in a really good way, a scholarly way, for 2 years, more than 2 years. So here we got this out in less than 3 months. I invited various people I've met in the various truth movements and justice movements to contribute, and I wanted to have a big tent and let all sorts of people contribute their views. I didn't want to say, okay, here's my interpretation, everybody has to follow it. Not at all. And I didn't even say you have to even bring up the false flag angle. Anybody who's got a kind of a counter view of the official line on Charlie Hebdo, show it to me, and we'll bring them all together. I especially wanted a diversity of voices from the religious side. We ended up with 3 Jews, 2 of whom are strong supporters of Israel. We have 7 Muslims, including myself. We have a conservative Catholic, Thaddeus Kaczynski, a professor of humanities, as well as the world's leading Protestant theologian, John Cobb. So we'll go over some of the people who were involved in endorsing it. David Ray Griffin quickly gave it his enthusiastic endorsement, calling it a breakthrough in the study of crimes against democracy. Richard Falk, who's one of the world's top international law professors, he's Jewish, by the way, but the hardline Israeli people absolutely hate him. He also endorsed it. Paul Hellyer, the former Canadian Minister of Defense, endorsed the book. And our contributors include Paul Craig Roberts, the architect of Reaganomics, and he's rather regretful about having done that now. He's one of our great dissident voices. He's a former editor of the Wall Street Journal. Cynthia McKinney, the person I voted for president in 2008. Don't blame me, I voted for Cynthia McKinney. She has a fantastic hard-hitting piece. Both her and Dr. Roberts, they just shred the false flags. I mean, there's no pussyfooting around with their pieces. Webster Tarpley, one of our greatest alternative historians, his seminal book here is 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA. John Cobb, as I said, the world's best, I think, highest esteemed liberal Protestant theologian. Rabbi Michael Lerner, who's been getting, every time he contributes to one of my books, he gets so much he gets attacks from his constituency. Even a lot of the sort of mainstream liberal Jewish constituency has a real hard time with a lot of this stuff. He contributed to my earlier analysis of 9/11 and American Empire, and he got so many attacks. They even vandalized his house in Berkeley. And then he's in this book, and once again he got the same treatment, to the point that now he's felt it necessary to distance himself from the book. God bless him for having the courage to contribute. Imran Hossein is one of the world's top Islamic scholars. He's actually the #1 Islamic eschatologist, or student of the end times. Brilliant man, one of our leading voices of 9/11 truth in the Islamic community. Barry Chamish, right-wing, pro-Zionist, but he likes truth. He's an investigative journalist. He's not going to lie to himself. Actually, he probably does lie to himself. He's not going to consciously lie to anybody. Barry's basically a decent guy. And here he is in the book telling us that he thinks Netanyahu did it to scare the French Jews into going to Israel. I actually wrote an article about Barry's piece here. I think it's news. I mean, I think this is news that one of Israel's top investigative journalists thinks that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu orchestrated the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. I would put that in the New York Times if I ran it, but I don't know. Yvonne Ridley's in the book. She's one of the maybe 5 or 6 people who don't really go there with the false flag angle, but look at the kind of cultural and historical background. And I do some of that too in the book. She's a prominent Muslim journalist. She converted to Islam after she had snuck into Afghanistan right after the US invasion, wearing a burqa, and she was captured by the Taliban, treated quite well. They were all gentlemen, and they treated her so well, she said that if they let her go, she would learn about Islam. And she then did. She returned to the UK and ended up converting to Islam. And she also was, I think, affected by learning that elements in the American military, or CIA, had actually planned to kill her and blame it on the Taliban. We have the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the book. He's a pretty important person in the world right now, as the Iran nuclear deal is about to bring Iran back into the community of nations. I don't know if that's a good thing for Iran or not, but probably is. And he touches lightly and very tactfully on the false flag angle, saying that his letter is to the young people of the West. He says, the older people are hidebound. They're probably not going to get this. But young people, please take a new look at Islam. All of this propaganda you're getting is complete nonsense. You know, you guys are young. You could probably see through it. And he says, don't let them convince you that their own terrorist assets are acting on behalf of Muslims. So that was the sentence from his piece that references the false flag angle. It was written as a letter to the young people of the West right after Charlie Hebdo, and my Iranian contacts said it was fine to use it in the book, so I did. And boy, has there been some counter-reaction. We've been getting great reviews and plugs from a whole lot of people. The Amazon reviews, last I looked, are like 15 or 20 5-star reviews, nothing else. But of course, it got hit with a sliming attack right as soon as it was published by somebody who couldn't even have read the book. But that's down now, apparently, because it was libelous. But there's been incredible reaction against this book. It's just amazing. First, we had President Hollande. This was even before the book came out, right before it came out, but it was well known to be in the pipeline. And the work that I'd done was very much, it was very prominent. A lot of people were following this and a lot of people knew it was a false flag. So the president of France reacted by first announcing that it might be necessary to ban conspiracy theories at the French, European, and international levels by having governments work with internet service providers to make sure that the kind of information that's in this book couldn't ever reach you. Then he ordered his personal think tank to produce what is essentially a police dossier on the conspiracy movement, which we're all part of here. And I'm proud to say that I was named by President Hollande's personal think tank as one of the 5 leading intellectuels conspirationnistes, or conspiracist intellectuals. So I wrote him a letter thanking him for that. He didn't mean it as a compliment. But that has a nice ring to it. It sounds a lot classier than conspiracy theorist. I like it, conspiracist intellectual. Or in French, it sounds even classier. I would order that on the menu. But it was a big reaction. And this is the quote where he's talking about the. Or rather, his Fondation Jean Jaurès, which is his think tank, is talking about the conspiracist movement. And the only French person in that, of the 5 top conspiracy people he mentions, is Thierry Meyssan. And for some reason, I think it's totally random. I mean, there are a lot of people that actually probably should be way ahead of me on this list. But anyway, this random list of really decent conspiracist intellectuals includes me, Wayne Madsen, Michel Chossudovsky of Canada. He's a professor of globalization studies in Canada. And he also had Wayne Madsen, Webster Tarpley, and William Engdahl. So, okay, I'm happy to be in their company. So this was my letter thanking President Hollande. I suggested that since Paul Craig Roberts, who wrote this article about Charlie Hebdo being a false flag that's in the book, is a recipient of the French Medal of the Legion of Honor, but he's not one of the top 5 conspiracist intellectuals. Since I am, I deserve a Medal of the Legion of Honor too. So where's my medal? So I wrote him a letter demanding that he award me the French Medal of the Legion of Honor, and then photoshopping a little picture of him doing so. Canada then wouldn't let me come to Toronto to speak about this book. They trumped up this bizarre excuse at the border. They claimed they had an arrest sheet from the FBI. It had a couple of relatively minor arrests, but it also had a bunch of bizarre, untrue stuff. They claimed I was arrested for felony drug sales in, it was June of 1977 in Wisconsin. And though I'm from Wisconsin and had been in Wisconsin prior to June, actually that June I was not even in Wisconsin. And I think I would have heard if I had ever been arrested for felony drug sales. So there's a bunch of this stuff that something funny is going on with these records. And they came up with this, it turned, I've talked to lawyers in the US, it shouldn't stand up. So I'm planning to get into Canada on this Charlie Hebdo book tour. I've got paperwork showing that I was never arrested for drugs, blah, 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 blah. So I should be speaking in Vancouver and in 4 cities in Alberta coming up in a couple of weeks. But when I was trying to go through to get into Canada, and she was friendly and just about to, then she runs my passport suddenly It's the fifth degree. And I'm being hauled off to be searched. They wreck my glove compartment, ripping off the door. I was really treated like an international terrorist. And there was something when they ran my passport that came up that led them to do that. Probably had something to do with a reaction against what's in this book. The Harper regime in Canada, just like the Sarkozy regime used to be in France, is very much, very strongly pro-Netanyahu. Some Canadians these days are saying that they're living in Israeli-occupied territory, so maybe that's part of it. And then the Anti-Defamation League, which is an operation very much tied in with the State of Israel that primarily tries to keep a lid on effective criticism of Israel and Israeli policies, and is very much aligned with the right wing of the Zionist movement. They try to disguise it by occasionally doing something sort of liberal, but that's basically what they are. They're an Israeli propaganda outfit. And they've been coming after me hot and heavy, including with this attack on the book. And the way they tried to portray the book was if I was this evil anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist putting out all this stuff, when in fact, I'm perhaps contributing about 1/10 of the material in the book. And the other 9/10 is from all these other people. We have, again, 3 Jewish contributors, 2 of whom are very strongly pro-Israel. Rabbi Michael Lerner is proud that his kid serves in the IDF. That horrifies me. To me, that's like if I said, oh, I'm proud my grandfather was in the SS, Rabbi. He would probably find that really offensive, right? Well, I feel the same way when he says that he's proud his kid was in the IDF. I don't agree with him at all on a lot of things. But I respect him in many areas. He's doing good work. And he had a good critique of the media lockstep on Charlie Hebdo. So I said, welcome, come on, contribute to the book. And these ADL people are completely ignoring the fact that we have these 3 Jewish contributors, one who's a critic of Israel, Professor Lawrence Davidson, and 2 pro-Israel Jews, as well as a wide variety of takes on this. Webster Tarpley saying it wasn't the Israelis that did it. We have all kinds of interesting viewpoints here. But they're trying to make it out as if this whole book is one big attack on Israel from the evil Muslim anti-Semite Kevin Barrett. And then we've had death threats. The death threats have gotten revved up. I've had a few death threats over the years. I had a deluge of them in 2006 when I was exiled from the University of Wisconsin and from the American academic community for investigating 9/11. Lynn Cheney's think tank, ACTA, the American College of Teachers, or Council of Teachers and Alumni, put out an attack Barrett piece to their spam list, giving them my email address. And so I got more misspelled death threats than you would ever imagine could come in. I figured if they couldn't spell like 3 or 4 letter words, they probably weren't much of a threat to actually carry anything out very competently. And then that kind of died down a little bit. But there's one really kind of unpleasant one from a nutcase in Georgia that has been revived now, post this Charlie Hebdo book coming out. And then we've got this weird wing, these people who say that they're part of the 9/11 truth movement, but all they do is try to cause dissension and conflict within the movement. And one of those people is wishing death on me on their forum. So there's been a whole lot of this kind of pushback, which it strikes me as a little extreme given that the book itself is trying to bring people together from these diverse backgrounds and religions to discuss Charlie Hebdo. We're not even forcing you to accept the view that it's a false flag. We just want to think critically about this. And boom, they start throwing rotten vegetables at me. It kind of makes you wonder. But the book is doing very well. It's got, a while back it was all 5-star reviews. It probably still is. And it just got reviewed by Barry Zwicker and Graham McQueen. Zwicker is one of Canada's leading media analysts. And he was a big-time mainstream media analyst, like almost Bill Moyer's level in Canada, until he became a 9/11 truther. And then they tried to marginalize him. And Graham McQueen is a professor of actually Buddhist studies who's written a book on the 9/11 anthrax operation, pointing out that it was the same operation. 9/11 anthrax, it's one thing. Don't talk about 9/11 separately from the anthrax attacks. It's the same thing, 9/11 anthrax. So his book is called The 2001 Anthrax Deception. And he and Barry Zwicker wrote a very glowing and excellent review of this book. So there it is on Amazon. For $16.84 plus shipping, you're probably going to pay a little over $20. But we have it here for a flat old $20 bill. And we also have lots of answers to any questions or discussion with you that you like. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.